we brought you here today. Let's try and get on topic. We really wanted to
Right.
get stuck in or drill deeper down into your journey across the Darien Gap.
Yeah.
So, um,
Oh,
where do we start? I know there was just getting there. There was an approach that was quite difficult to the Darien Gap, but we thought we'd break it down today. If you could help us bring it into some sections.
and you've got real. So this is really the last town, my last main town or the launch point in South America for the Darien Gap.
Okay.
Medellin's a very interesting place. It's a city built on drug money,
Okay.
by the likes of Pablo Escobar. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So Medellin was a really interesting time, and that's basically where this story begins. Because once I get to Medellin, it's where we knuckle down and start focusing on the Darién Gap.
This
big
is when
time.
you changed your image. You sort of got your ruffian sort of tramp look going and put things
Right.
into your vest and okay. Right.
Yes.
Let
Yeah.
me just kind of back up here, I think.
Yeah, I
Right.
remember there's a
Yeah,
red.
so here we go.
route
I mean, these are
and a
this
green
is
route.
stuff from my slide.
This is great.
Right, you would have seen some of these. So here we are looking at that region, and you can see here border region, but with Colombia to the south, Panama to the north.
Nice.
So this is that first real gap. Medellin is where we're situated at that time, where we basically now have to start doing a lot of research, trying to figure out how the hell we're going to do this, because we've got no real idea. And you have to remember at that time in 2000, there was a raging civil war, almost like a civil war, an insurgency within Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
So you got the FARC guerrillas, the armed forces, the revolutionary armed forces of Colombia, fighting the Colombians on 60 fronts throughout that country, on the outside of that country. So it's difficult times in Colombia at this time,
Okay.
and it's the height of the fighting.
Yeah.
To get my main objective is to get to Panama City. That's the end of this section, so to speak. That's where we're ultimately heading for. Between me and Panama City, there is a town called Yavitsa, and Yavitsa is where the road starts. That's the other side of the Darien Gap. So between me and there, things get a little trickier. That's where that road takes me to Panama City. On the Colombian side, the road gets me that far. That's the limitation, and then I have to get into what is known as the Darien Gap.
There we
And that's
have
this
it.
region
Nice.
here. There's two national parks basically that it's named after. Darien Gap, Darien National Park being on the Panamanian side. But that's the region we're talking about. So basically, you're looking at about 200-mile swamp jungle, which is the front line of fighting, unfortunately. So if we zoom in a little bit on that Colombian side, there we are in Medellin.
Okay.
There's the road going north. You can see Yavitsa on the other side of that green borderline.
Mm-hmm.
So phase one in front of me is basically a lot of mountainous terrain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something along those lines.
But you're on a road, dirt roads going through the mountains.
But you've got that road up to a certain point. Then what you've got between me and the Darien Gap is the Atrato River. And the Atrato River is a huge river. It's one of the biggest rivers in the world, volume size, water-wise. It's very deep. In parts, it's about sometimes it's a kilometer wide in parts. It's quite wide. So it's quite and either side of the Atrato River, you've got about 40 miles of basically what is swamp jungle. It's like the Everglades.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty much impassable, really.
So
And then that entire area is also just jungle. It's pretty much just jungle.
Mm-hmm.
Not like green area that you're seeing highlighted
How'd you get across that
So
river?
those are, and then eventually you're looking at the actual Darién Gap itself, that border region, that really dense jungle just beyond that. And that's what we're interested in getting to. Our opponent is getting to the jungle first and foremost. That's where the real challenge is. In that jungle, what you're kind of looking at is what we refer to as secondary jungle. Primary jungle is what you will think of when you're thinking about, for example, the Amazon. You have these big, high, thick, dense canopies that stop a lot of light getting to the forest floor. And maneuvering in those jungles is actually easier than it is maneuvering in, let's say, a secondary jungle, where there is no dense canopy and you've just got dense undergrowth.
Right.
So we were looking at a secondary jungle, which is a significant problem. On top of that, you've got the security situation. Obviously, the first concern was FARC. Fact that these people own that part of the world. You've also got a mix, and they could basically control everything west of kind of not far from Medellin and the jungle itself.
Oh, right. Okay.
Sorry.
We've managed to work out.
Sorry, what's FARC means?
What's it stand for?
What does it stand for?
It's Spanish. It's like Fuerzas Armadas Revoluciones de Colombia. So it's basically the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So these are the descendants of the Cuban Revolution, basically. Okay. They spawned from the same ideology.
All right. Okay.
And they've been fighting in the country for quite some time at this point. And then you've got an organization known as the right-wing paramilitaries or the Autodefensas, which is a right-wing paramilitary group that is countering the communist or revolutionary guerrillas, left-wing guerrillas. And it's basically both these groups plague Colombia at this time. A lot of death squads, a lot of massacres on either side. And then, of course, in between that, and they in this particular region, they own this kind of, they're active in this part of the world. And then you've got the Colombian army, which is apparently fighting both sides, somewhere in the middle. So the road ahead of me was looking something along those lines.
Wow.
And we've been able to work out this map slowly while we're sitting in Medellin at this time. It's getting dark around here. I'm probably going to disappear soon if they don't tell us lights, I guess. I hope a little.
You look good. It's good.
We're still good?
Yeah, you look good.
So while we were in Medellin, one of the first tasks I had was just to figure out what the hell I'm looking at. Because when we got to Medellin, we had no idea what's in front of us. We had just some basic knowledge that this was a war zone, dense jungle. So one of the things I had to do was to reach out to anybody and everybody who had it was in some way involved in the Darién Gap. So I talked to the police, the army, to local journalists, and to individuals who had lived and worked in that region. And we started to put together a map.
Okay.
And at this time, I got a new girlfriend. We were working together on this. She was helping me out, and
she was from
there was
Colombia.
a couple of she from Medellin.
Okay.
And there was one interesting time where we went to visit the local police HQ, which is the HQ for this entire region, including the Darién Gap. And we went up there to try and talk to somebody, and they left me sitting in a corridor. Can't get rid of it, but Siri keeps popping up. And we were sitting in a corridor waiting to be interviewed, and I got bored and decided to just kind of walk around, and I decided I'd just push my luck and walk into various rooms along this corridor in this building, and ended up in a room that was, the whole walls were lined with maps. And my last job in the British Army was the battalion intelligence cell, and literally my job was one of my jobs with the intelligence cell was maps.
Okay.
So I have a good relationship with maps
and navigation.
And for navigation, but also in the military, everyone uses the same symbology on those maps. So
Okay.
I walk into these offices and I see the maps all marked up with standard NATO military symbolism, which wouldn't mean much to most people, but for me it was a bonanza.
Okay.
So I would walk into this room and see the maps all basically marked up with all the positions and various group sizes and things. And then moments later, someone would walk in and catch me and like just go ape shit. What are you doing here? Yada yada yada. Then I just play dumb and say look, and I'm a skinny. I got long hair and all the rest of it. I look like a real hippie.
Yeah.
And I'm just, I don't know, man. I went in the wrong room. I'm looking for the bathroom or something. And they're like, get out, and all this kind of thing. So I would walk out of that room with just this wealth of information that I wasn't privy to.
Right.
And all of this plays into this story as we go into the Darién Gap. So I started gathering a lot of information in that regards. We'll just push through here. This talks about. So I started, and these are actually what we're looking at now. Are a couple of images that I was faxing to my father in the UK.
Okay.
Wow.
You're sort of developing.
Me and my father.
Yeah.
Who's ex-special forces. So to me and him, being ex-army, this was what we refer to as an escape and evasion exercise. We had to get from A to B through enemy lines without being captured, basically. That was the game at foot. So the first half of this was just gathering intelligence. So I started, like I say, collecting this information by various dubious means in Medellin. And that also involved, one day I had a really good interview with a Colombian colonel who sat me down and had a real frank conversation with me one day, talking about, anything on that road going northwest out of Medellin. He says, you're going to have a really hard time because anything that moves on that road is being watched.
Karl, can I cut in here? I'm curious about the map. I'm looking at it, and
right.
What can you tell us a little bit about the arrows and the symbology on here a little bit?
Yeah. So this is all the information that we're putting together during this period. So these conversations, looking at those maps and all the rest of it. So before I left Medellin, this was basically kind of like some of the information that we managed to collect.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, we're talking about various route options when we're looking at what's in front of us. So you'll see Medellin down there at the bottom.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny. These are the days we used to hand draw things on paper.
It's pretty
Intense.
intense.
Is this your drawing?
Yeah, these are all just hand drawings. So these were faxed home. These would be faxed home.
You drew this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
are
It's pretty cool.
great
Yeah. So
artist.
basically. Yeah, so basically we're looking at what the Colombians regard to as the 34th front on that 60 front war against FARC. And they had two FARC brigade-sized units marked on the map. One within what you refer to as the Lemon Mountains in the Darién Gap. And one group that seemed to be moving to the west of Medellin.
Mhm.
So we had a good idea of the areas that these groups were operating in. And there was one contested part of the road that seems to be, whose ownership was ambiguous between the right-wing paramilitaries, the army, and FARC.
Okay, what's the red arrows and what's the black arrows?
The red arrows was what we refer to as the red route. The black arrows was the black route. The black route was the most extreme version of the route. This was whereby we would avoid all contact with humanity where possible. So mostly cross-country.
Mm-hmm.
The red route, we would rely on a certain amount of infrastructure. So that road going north out of Medellin.
Mm-hmm.
And we would hop, skip, and jump across those villages at the narrowest section of the gap. The Darién Gap. So there were two different approaches here. The black was quite extreme. The red was more risky because you're basically
putting yourself
as a Westerner walking through a war zone, basically, with all these horror stories attached to it. And that road, that section of road that we're looking at, had a really, was a pretty terrible place. It was constantly, the FARC would have offenses, and they would take the towns along that road. And they would then, the army would come and take them back, and then FARC would retake it, and it just goes back and forth. And it's a bloody and nasty place. Talking to some of the people in those villages along the road, they tell you about the times when FARC starts the attack. What happens is they bombard the town with homemade mortars. So basically, gas cylinders packed with explosives, and they literally drop these things on the town. And then once it's done enough damage and push the Colombian troops into disarray, then they'll storm the village. And then the next thing the villagers have to put up is when the army comes back, they come back with helicopter gunships, and they just swarm around the village, just pummeling it with gunfire from the air to try and chase the FARC back out.
The rebels.
And it's just this constant, back and forth in these towns.
So I see you have a line here. It's the FARC, and then you have a red line, and it's the army. Yeah.
There are a couple of lines there.
Yeah. I'm just. So there's also this area where there's a circle with a lot of red lines through it. I'm guessing this is where the FARC sort of mobilizes, or that's their camps.
You've got areas of control that are contested areas north of there that belong to the AUC. You've got a couple of HQs on there. There were two places where one was supposedly HQ for the AUC, and one was an HQ location for FARC, according to the information I was gathering. That's about it.
Okay.
On that particular map. This was a preliminary map that I'd sent home fairly early on in that conversation.
So are these FARC headquarters where it's like a square with, it looks like an envelope and says...
No, the envelope things with the crosses on that, they denote units, size, they're infantry units.
Okay.
It's denoted by FARC, but this is where they had them on the map that I was talking about in those offices.
Oh, right. Gotcha. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so, and you can see that the approach we had to these two different routes, the red route would mean what we try and do was dumb down my appearance so that I would look like a hobo, so that you weren't worth kidnapping, because a lot of these guerrilla groups, they're living off kidnapping, especially in Colombia at that time.
Sure.
So the idea was to try and de-westernize myself, or at least make myself look worthless to anybody, so that the only thing you're going to get from me, should you kidnap me, is going to be ticks and fleas. That was the aim. So we spent a bit of time, we dived into that, and we dyed my hair, we dyed my skin darker, and we spent some time looking at all the ways we could do that. We even spent some time looking for dark contact lenses. Until we suddenly realized there isn't a need for dark contact lenses in South America. So we went, okay, stupid.
That's funny.
So we abandoned the contact lens thing.
Okay.
And we'd spent quite a lot of time. I think we had a period of time, because in the Darién Gap there is a dry season and a wet season. And you need the dry season. Yeah. In the wet season, the rivers are going to be raging torrents, and it's going to make life incredibly difficult, if not just downright dangerous.
Right.
It's not impossible to get through the jungles during the wet season. So we had like 2 months or something to play with before the dry season started. And it was during this time that we spent a lot of time, talking to a lot of people, talking to the army and police, and gathering all this information, and working with my father on a plan. The black route, of course, was we'd gone into real detail about how we could navigate in worse circumstances. So we'd looked at using the high grounds and peaks, all the things that I would be able to establish or be able to find in very difficult circumstances. And of course, part of that plan was to, I think I'm going forward again. I don't seem to be able to go backwards for some reason. Okay, there we go. Too far now. Well, of course, the black route it turned out eventually was a little bit out of our depth. It meant spending a lot of time, because at one point we were going to use the Atrato River and actually float down that Atrato River. And the problem with rivers in these jungles is that everyone uses them as highways. That's friend and foe alike.
Right, that's
so
pretty common.
It's very, very hard to conceal yourself and not get captured in a river. Once you get spotted, there's no escape. So, and there's real reason to be concerned here. If you look at the history of the Darién Gap from our perspective, when we were in Medellin researching this, there's a lot of horror stories. There was a Canadian backpacker who disappeared, and eventually they found his body full of bullet holes in the jungle. There is a Russian cyclist who was stopped on that road that we're discussing. He was stopped by FARC and then literally just shot in the head, just executed. And these are left-wing guerrillas. And then 9 months prior to my arrival in Medellin, a couple of British botanists had gone into the jungle looking for rare orchids of all things. And they had disappeared, had never been heard of again, and were presumed dead. So there was this, a pretty grim atmosphere about anything north of Medellin at that time. The British media was referring to it as one of the darkest places in the world.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty intimidating place to face at that point when you're on your own.
Did you?
You had to really.
For a moment, were you thinking this wasn't possible? You're not going to be able to pull this one off? I mean, obviously, a lot of fear.
This was this was in our realm. This, like I said, as two ex-soldiers, me and my father, this was an escape and evasion exercise, and this is something that we thought we could do.
Okay.
It's dodgy, it's difficult, but it plays into our strengths at this point, if you like. With the information that we were putting together, I thought, you know what, I think we could do this. On the left-hand side, there was a basic, sketch and description of how I thought we could play it.
So were
the
you
black route and the red route combined?
So you were gaming more for the black route?
Originally, yeah, but then it became pretty evident early on that we weren't going to be able to carry the kind of logistics required to pull off the black route.
Yeah, you wouldn't have the.
It was that the terrain was horrific. The amount of supplies I was going to have to carry because it's going to be slow. We just decided we weren't going to be able to pull it off. We were going to have to rely on the infrastructure available just to keep myself fed.
Okay.
Ultimately.
Wow.
So we decided we'd go with the red route. And then, of course, that means we had to do the whole dumbed down in disguise thing, be a vagrant, disguise all my equipment in sacks. And there would be two phases here. Let me see if I can go forward. Yeah, that's the black route there you would have been looking at. So basically, it would have been land navigation into the Trato River, and you could spend maybe a week or two in that river, basically floating at night.
So that river flows north.
It flows north, and that was our best chance to get beyond all of those jungles and swamps and all the rest of it. So we'd have to travel. The idea would travel at night, camouflage yourself, get into the river, and then float, and then just go with the flow every day, making progress until we can get to a point in the Darién Gap where we can get out of that river on firm enough ground and head for the border. And that's what all the navigation and the high grounds would be using those various locations to do that. Red routes, a lot easier technically, basically along that road, and then up until we have to break off that road and then use whatever's available to get to the river. In this case, there was access to a little village called Rio Sucio. And then again, we'd have to at some point use that river. Again, we'd use flotation aids into the river until we could get onto firm enough ground to get out of that into the Darién and head for the border.
So you floated that section. How did you do that?
We're getting way ahead of ourselves there.
Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
So if you want a detailed account of the story, then we got to start back in Medellin and then start on that journey up the road there. Yeah. At the moment, we're still in Medellin. We're still planning this thing.
Exciting. Okay.
So that's what we were looking at when we're in Medellin. So like I said, we did the whole hobo thing. So this is what we ended up looking like. We basically gone to full on the arts and crafts here
Don't want to bring that guy home to meet
like all the
mom.
news and dirty. Exactly. And you can see there that my backpack was still my backpack, but just we kind of disguised it as kind of what it looked like, some kind of
More than
hodgepodge
natural. Yeah.
construction out of sacks and things, knapsacks and stuff. And that's basically what we use going forward. And this is the Colombian family I'd stayed with. There's Catalina, who had now become my girlfriend.
That's great.
And that's
man.
the morning we were saying goodbye.
Oh, okay.
And then
times.
away you go over the hills and over the mountains, so to speak. And this was an interesting part of that journey. We had quite a bit of equipment because we had two approaches. We had this kind of road phase where we used this hobo disguise, and we had, and we'll talk about this later, a jungle phase where we would ditch the disguise and go into jungle mode. But that's another thing. But all my equipment and stuff for jungle mode is in the back there. And we pushed on over these hills looking rough and rugged. And you see, once you get some altitude in Colombia, it's amazing how cold it gets. And I remember some really rough nights because at one point here I'm packing so much weight and I'm having such a hard time that I actually got rid of my sleeping bag. I'm only using a hammock at the time. And I remember having some really tough times up there because we got some real altitude and then things got cold pretty quick. So I had a couple of sleepless nights. I remember knocking on someone's door once and scrounging things like blankets and things from them. Once you get into these villages on the other side, it's quite evident that you're in a war zone. There's a lot of security, a lot of military, a lot of army, etc. So you see a lot of that on the road.
Wow.
And then eventually you get to a point where we go into what we call jungle mode. So we're leaving the road system. We'd had a couple of close run-ins on the road system. I think one of the scariest encounters was early on that road trip. There's a village called Gordas Cañas. And I remember I was trying to avoid the large towns and trying to go around them. And I had to go into the town to cross a bridge at one point. And as I made my way towards this bridge, a whole group of guys stood up in front of me on the road and were looking at me. And I kind of looked it down and got really nervous and thought, this looks sketchy. So I kind of sidestepped into a little cafe on the side of the road, a stall. And I got a Coca-Cola, about one of the only things I could afford at the time, from the shop owner, and I sat down and I was running through my mind, what's the plan? I'm probably gonna have to go figure out another way around this because that didn't look good back there at all. And then in no time, those guys arrived at the store and they walked in looking at me, and the shop owner just left, and then they pulled down the shutters. So I'm sitting alone with these guys now in this store, and they pull out their shirts so that I can see the pistols tucked into their pants. And then they make this tough guy kind of show of force, and I'll come stand over me and start this kind of interrogation style conversation, a series of questions. And at this point, I'm kind of, I'm freaked out. I don't know who these guys are. I don't know if I'm talking to FARC. I don't know if I'm talking to the right-wing paramilitaries. So we have this really difficult conversation, and I'm basically using my lack of Spanish whenever I don't like a question to my advantage, and trying to steer the conversation best I can at that point. And what I had with me for situations just like this was I had a whole bunch of press clip cuttings from various newspapers from South America at this point, all talking about my journey. And I had them laminated, and they were on hand just for this kind of situation, to try and talk my way out of something. Yeah. Because this area, this region, it's such been the type of conflict zone that it is. There is suspicion of everything and anybody on that road, because it's insurgency and counterinsurgency, it's narcotics and counter narcotics, and in this area you have everybody working on every side. It's you have all those cocaine plantations the cartels have in that jungle. They're being protected by the guerrillas who tax that operation and funds their war to huge amounts of money. This brings in various organizations like the DEA, CIA. You've got organizations like the IRA, British paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, training FARC guerrillas on explosives. That brings in, people like MI5 and MI6, and you've just got this hellish, confused zone where anybody could be anybody. So you're suspicious to everybody. So these guys have pinned me down, and they're trying to figure out who I am, and I'm trying to figure out who they are, and I don't know where this is going to go. And then I got these newspaper clippings out, and they sat down and they start reading through them. And then eventually they identified themselves as auto defenses. These are the right-wing paramilitaries, which is a good deal.
Okay, so
because generally
you got the
speaking,
good guys.
the right-wing paramilitaries don't have a problem with Westerners, whereas FARC have three enemies, which is the Colombian army, or Colombian government, basically the right-wing paramilitaries, and Westerners. Everyone else who's a Westerner and isn't communist revolutionary. Finding these right-wing paramilitaries was a pretty good deal. And the conversation turned at this point as well, and things began to relax, and they became really interested in who I was, and the conversation became a lot more friendly. And then by the time they were like, yeah, best of luck on your way kind of thing. And then they even paid for my Coke at the end of it. So that all worked.
Now you're winning.
Great.
Yeah.
So away we went on our merry way, having had our first real confrontation, our first real meeting with these right-wing paramilitary groups. And it went pretty well.
Okay.
And
great.
beyond that, I would meet them a couple of times. So sometimes what you'd find is a motorbike with two guys on it carrying guns in civilian clothes would come out to me, meet me on the road, and they would stop me, and they'd be very polite, and they'd ask who I am and for my paperwork, and they'd want to check my equipment. And it would almost be like being at a professional checkpoint. They'd be kind of be polite and courteous, and they'd look through your stuff, and then they'd say, okay, great, no problem, and they'd get back on their motorbikes, get back on the radio, and then they'd shoot off. So you were being watched constantly on that road.
Okay.
There was only one section of the road where I had to avoid the road, and I had to go cross country because FARC apparently, it was the only spot at this time that FARC apparently held that road. So I had to do a rather treacherous cross country section where I ended up scaling these really steep embankments around a river valley, and eventually got back on the road on the other side, and then pushed on until you get up to the point where it's time to leave the road. And during this phase as well, I'm staying with the Colombian army during this process. So I'd meet the Colombian army a lot on the road, as well as these right-wing paramilitaries. And now, being an ex-soldier, I was just taking a lot of interest in all of this. And I would take a lot of interest in the Colombian army and how they go about, what are their operating procedures, their weapons, the radio, and I just, their discipline and the way that they conduct themselves is just interesting to me at this point. But I'm really learning quite a lot. And the same with the right-wing paramilitaries, as I met them quite a few times, I was able to establish a good idea of where they have these radio stations or these central points or hubs that they operate from. I even stayed in one of these buildings one night at one part. So it was, and I'm gathering all this information, and with the army, the Colombian soldiers, they talk a lot because they don't necessarily know that I understand all of this thing. Again, I'm skinny, dirty looking, hippie, tramp-like looking thing, who would kick up a conversation, and sometimes I'd sit with the officer in charge of whatever group that I'm with, and we would compare maps. There's those maps again. So he would get his map out. And sure enough, his map is marked up with information, which is just a couple of shapes and numbers to most people. But to me, that's a unit that X, or those two little dashes next to it, means it's a brigade or a battalion, where those numbers are placed in the positions around that square shape denotes the size of number of the unit in its formation. And so I'm looking at a map and I'm like, and he's showing me like rivers and mountains and places we can and can't go, and I'm looking at all this other information. I'm like, oh, awesome, that's just what I need to know. And it's just curious, it's just interesting information, but I'm gathering all this as we're going. So this would happen quite a lot, and I'd talk to the Colombian soldiers, and they'd talk about turnaround times, the size of a unit, when's the next time that they get relief in place. And I'd be watching, like I say, their equipment, the radios and all that kind of thing, discipline and stuff, which is just interesting. So all of this I was gathering on our merry way. So eventually I have to leave that road, and I have to try and get to that river system. And I try a couple of routes that don't pan out before I have to try that track to the town of Rio Sucio. This is what we refer to as the jungle phase. Okay. So at this point, I decided to ditch this disguise, which was, wasn't really working. People still paid a lot of attention to you like they would anything. Because, you're obviously not from that part of the world. They know it. You're a Westerner, no matter how hard you try. So we're going into the jungle phase, and the jungle phase was basically now, again, as soldiers, and we looked at this as an escape and evasion, so pretty standard behind enemy line stuff. And we broke your equipment down and clothing into layers. So you'd have this backpack. We had a combat vest, which we'd got from Colombian Army, and then this layer of clothing that we'd specifically put together for the jungle. And we have it in layers. So the idea in the military speaking wise, and in jungles especially, is if you have to run for it. So if I had to make a break for it, what first thing you got to do is you got to ditch that backpack. It's hard to run through a jungle with a backpack on it and get caught up, and you just won't be able to do it. So you ditch that, and then you have your so you can run and maneuver through that jungle with a vest on, with the most important stuff in that vest. So navigation and water and some food and stuff like that. If you're captured and they take everything off of you except the clothes that you're standing in, that layer of clothing is your last layer. And hidden within that clothing is all the escape and evasion equipment or survival stuff, should you manage to have a chance, an opportunity to make a run for it once you've been captured.
Okay, I see you have quite a few things.
Basically, what you do is you sew all of this stuff into the seams and pockets and anywhere you can in your clothing, so that even if they pat you down, and if they go around you, they won't find this stuff. So stuff like money. So we had US dollars in plastic, and that would be kind of sewn into the reinforced patches on my knees and around the bottom of the pants and things like that. And in the back of the jacket, between layers of material, we had a cloth map that we'd made of the region.
Wow.
And we had button compasses, you have wire snares, you have a fishing kit, you have some basic medicines, painkillers, even little knives, razor blades, paracord, all that kind of stuff. So all of that is sewn into everything, and it's amazing what you can get in there.
Wow.
And you can't find
great.
it, unless you really, really start to take clothing apart. So should you get the opportunity and you can just run with what you have, you've got all that available to you. And that was pretty much jungle mode. And there are a couple of funny stories where this comes into play as well later on. So eventually we get to a point where there is these two small villages, Bagira and Rio Sucio. And I arrive in Bagira, and what I find there is I get into this village at the end of the day, and there's a meeting going on in the village town.
How long did it take you, Karl? Sorry, how long did it take you to get from, you walked that road? Yeah, to get to that point.
Ooh, it's been a couple of weeks.
Yeah, wow.
I think maybe 2 weeks or something like that. I can't remember exactly. Something along those lines.
So when you're
It's
here,
like a 300 and something. Is it kilometers or miles?
when you get here, do you have to like
So we've been on the ground a while at
provision?
this.
Do you have to buy food and stuff in your packs? You have to get ready to go through the
Oh,
jungle.
we're buying food. Yeah, we're buying food along the road. I mean, we have a certain amount, but we have a very limited budget at this point.
Okay.
I actually brought with me in my backpack is all the rations that we would need for that section of the actual gap itself.
Okay.
The actual jungle. So I've got these homemade packages of food,
Mm-hmm.
which were very lean, very lean. So I had those in my backpack. We were reserving them for the heart of the jungle. But as we go along, we're basically picking food as we can along the red route. That's why we decided on the red route to be able to do that. We're going to have to live off that road.
Mm-hmm.
So I arrive in this village, and then I have to get I'm told that I have to get permission from the right-wing paramilitaries to be there. It's all very confusing because the army is also there, co-located with these right-wing paramilitaries, and at this point, you suddenly realize that the army and the right-wing paramilitaries are clearly operating together in this environment. They're clearly here. The right-wing paramilitary boss is actually standing in the middle of the square in the town, and he's talking to the town at that time. Everyone's gathered at the square, and around the square is the army hanging out while he's giving this talk. And the people tell me, okay, this is the boss man. He's the guy you got to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
So after he finishes his talk to the people, I go over there and I have to ask him, I got to get through to Rio Sucio. I'm supposed to talk to you. And he goes into a whole conversation about, well, it's kind of dumb, it's kind of stupid. He says, and he was questioning who I am, and we had this long, drawn-out conversation. And then he gets together with these two other guys, and he basically tells me that, they actually walk me to the end of the village, and they take me to the beginning of this track that I have to follow.
Okay.
And then they're basically saying, now listen, Gringo, you have to understand that nobody goes down that track. Right?
Yeah.
FARC own that track. So Rio Sucio is under siege right now by FARC.
Mm-hmm.
And they own that track. And when none of us go down that track. And then the words you'll never forget, he says, if they catch you on that track, they will put you under the knife, Gringo, because the gunshot will give away their position.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
This is a pretty testy day right now. And then, so we're standing on that track, and he's pointing down the track, and he's telling me all of this, and he's saying, "Do you still want to go down that track?" And I do remember sitting, kind of looking at my feet, kicking dust, and thinking to myself, well, there's never any real question about it. This day was coming for as long as long before I began this expedition. We kind of realized that one day we would be on this track.
Yeah.
Where you were looking at something that's really serious, and you were gonna go. So there was no question about it. And we're like, yep, I'm going down that track. And he was like, yeah, whatever. Best of luck to you. And I was on my merry way. And as I'm leaving this town, this village, as I'm leaving this village, I'm literally passing the Colombian army, dug in defensive positions either side of the road. They're literally in trenches, guns pointing out.
Really?
And they're watching this idiot Gringo walking down this road, out onto this what can only be described as like Ho Chi Minh territory, Vietnam or something. But and they were just like, troops kind of jumped out of the trenches, and they're like, no, where are you going? And I'm like, I'm just on this suicidal track.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, it's not a good idea. So they took me to see their commander. So I would spend the night with this officer on this defensive position, trying to convince him that I want to go down this track, and they wouldn't let me go until they got permission. So they had to, again, talk to higher headquarters. Sure. And then the next morning, I had to sit with the officer, and we had to do a dictaphone conversation. So they recorded a conversation where they explained everything carefully, and then I had to repeat that I understood and say, yes, you told me everything. I get it. This is my responsibility. Because the army was saying, look, we can't stop you, but we need you to understand where you're going. And then I had to sign paperwork as well to that effect. And once we'd got all that out of the way, they radioed to Rio Sucio, to the troops in Rio Sucio, and said, there's this idiot coming.
We got this crazy coming your way. Get prepared.
Expect this crazy guy to arrive or not in the next couple of days. And they were like, okay, good luck. And away you went the next day. And it was
so when you're going this track is a jungle track, but it's just a jungle trail.
Yeah.
Are you sort of keeping your eyes and ears open? If you hear something, you ditch the track and hide in the bush? What's the sort of plan? How do you go through this?
Hey, at this point, your eyes are like dinner plates. Like you have never been so finely tuned to your environment.
Right.
Yeah.
Once you get into a place like this.
Sharp.
Like
Sharp.
every little noise.
Yeah.
You're paying attention to so much right now because your adrenaline's going, so you're alive. You are alive now. And as I'm leaving this part of the world, there's a couple of burned out buildings on the outskirts there with FARC graffiti on there. And they referred to FARC as the Dragon of Udabar. That particular FARC unit, because just north of us is the Udabar inlet or bay on the coastline there. So this was the FARC units that we were facing was the Dragon of Udabar. And when you get into the jungle here, have you ever heard the howler monkeys?
Just
like the howler?
No, I haven't heard them
There's
personally.
howler monkeys.
But just
they're scary
on documentaries,
noise. So there you are in this very quiet jungle, and all you've got is these howler monkeys making this noise that sounds pretty much just like the dragon.
Everything.
Yeah, so it sets the scene perfectly.
Oh
Really
my God.
creepier than these jungle noises and these terrifying monkey howls, just echoing throughout this jungle. Just a pitch perfect atmosphere for the movie that one day we'll make of this, I'm sure. So we've got all these howling monkeys, and you're going off into the jungle, and it's tough going because nobody uses that track anymore. So eventually you get so far down it that it starts to become overgrown.
How are you how are you navigating that? I mean, obviously there's areas
you've got to stick to that track. You just have to stick to the track, right? I've got no map. There's no map with this track on it.
Right.
So you can't lose this damn thing. And if you do, but I mean, if you
then
do,
you gotta
lose
find
it, you're going to
it
end up in neck deep in water at some point. So you've just got to. You can't really but stay on it, considering. But FARC's out there, and this is just a huge problem. FARC's out there somewhere.
Right.
So eventually, it's a 2-day trip. So it's basically 60 kilometers broke down. I do 30 Ks a day. So I basically get to halfway point, and then the idea is we'd get off into the jungle and hide. And that was the plan. We were doing this as what we would call tactical. So there's no light, there's no noise. You're eating cold food, and you're camouflaged, right?
Yeah.
You're hiding basically now. For example, those British botanists that disappeared in the Darién Gap, they might not, if they're not ex-military, chances are they weren't doing the same kind of thing. And that's how you're going to get yourself caught, right? And the following accounts is a perfect example of why that could have happened. So I'm set up in camp, eating some cold food from a packet, not making any noise. And at last light, just as it's too dark now, but at last light, you get that deep, dark blue. And I'm in a hammock in the trees.
Yeah.
And I can see through the trees to where the track is. And I can see some sky out there above these palm trees. And I hear something coming down the track. And it sounds like horses to me at first. And I'm watching and I'm listening. And eventually, the first individuals now arrive, clipping that the blue light and are silhouetted against that sunlight, that sunset. And I can start to make out individuals, and I start counting, and you can hear that distinct metal gun sound when people are traveling with guns. As a soldier, it's probably more identifiable to me than most people. But when basically you're now looking at an armed patrol, and I counted 20 individuals on the track going the same direction as me. Now, as far as anyone is concerned, that's FARC. So I've got FARC out. I've got a 20-man FARC patrol just swinging right past me. I'm about 10 feet from that track. And I'm watching that go by. And that's an eye-opener. And so the next morning, I think, this is really, really worrying me, the fact that they were going in the same direction that I now have to go. Again, having been a soldier, we trained and fought for jungle warfare, and I know that jungle warfare is all about ambushes on tracks. And in the jungles, it's he who can get the most ammunition down the fastest gets to ask the questions later.
That's the rule.
So it's just who can shoot the fastest and who can shoot the most.
Who's left standing.
The greatest volume of fire gets to ask the question later after the confusion. So jungle warfare is close, scary, and brutal. So my main concern as I'm getting back onto that track is what am I going to walk into on that track now? So I'm absolutely terrified. And the only thing I can hear, your fine sense, your finely tuned senses, it's the birds. When you disturb birds, they make alarm calls. Normally you don't pay much attention to it. But on this morning, those birds that are screaming my presence and screaming, there he is, there he is, with every time they make a squawking sound, it's just driving me insane. And the more I kind of wave my arms around and panic about it, the louder the birds scream. So there's just this cacophony of screaming birds that's telling everybody for miles around that there's some dickhead on the track right now. And that's one of the things I take away from that track is this horrifying sound of these birds giving every move I made, just yelling at me, yelling at everyone that I'm there. Just hideous.
Did you shoot them away? How did you?
Well, that's it. You can't, because like I was saying, the more you wave your arms around, the louder they scream at you, and that's basically how it works.
Oh my God.
So they ain't going to shut up. And then so we progressed that day. At that point, we were low on food and water. I was pretty weak, and I remember getting pretty dehydrated on that track as well. And at some point, we started losing the track, and there was these open patches of deep grass. Everything would disappear. So I would have to climb trees. I would climb trees, and once you get high enough in a tree, you can kind of see a very faint trail in these grasslands that you can't see from ground level. So you were able to pick out this track and just stay with it by any which way you could by using these techniques. And then eventually you get so far down that track that you start to find some outlying farms of Rio Sucio. And I remember being really bad. I'm probably just exhausted, probably nervous exhaustion more than anything, I think. When I got to the other side, I felt pretty ill, and I was thinking I was just dehydrated. But I eventually arrive in Rio Sucio to find all these troops in defensive positions around Rio Sucio, and I kind of just collapsed next to them, and there's a couple of guys hanging out around me, and they're all like, "Yay, great!
You made it! Here's the crazy guy."
And I'm like pointing down the track saying, "Fuck!" And I'm like, "Yeah, we know, we know. We're here for a reason, buddy. We're here behind these sandbag walls for a reason."
Right.
So yeah, it was all pretty interesting. So what I ended up doing now is staying with the soldiers on this defensive position, and I just barracked with them in these. They had these like abandoned little huts and buildings around, linked together with these sandbag walls and some trenches and things. But it was all very loose, and it was all very sketchy. And I remember I decided to hang out with these soldiers while I kind of recuperated, got some food down me, and then looked at this next stage, which is the river stage. So I took a couple of days rest at this point, and I hung out with these soldiers, and it was interesting and kind of scary at night. At night, we were right on the edge of where the Rio Sucio intersects with the Atrato River, and their defenses were, I would say, pathetic at best. And I just had this horrifying feeling all night long that FARC was just beyond these defensive positions, looking for a way in here. And to me, it wouldn't have been difficult at all to creep up the banks of this river, up into this hut where I am right now, right on the edge of this defensive position, and just slit all our throats during the night before the assault begins. And I'm just having these nightmares. And again, I'm just like freaked out by this whole situation, and every sound is just keeping me awake.
Yeah.
And they've got soldiers walking around on sentry, just following their usual sentry duty thing. And you know they're there because you can hear them, because the mosquito thing right now in this part of the world was just horrific. The worst, one of the worst, two worst places I've ever seen in the world. The mosquito there is just a creature from hell. So you're always engulfed in a cloud of mosquitoes. In the evening, all you can hear is the soldiers walking around, and they have towels, and they're just thwapping themselves with towels, like horses' tails. Because literally, they can just make things opaque. Like my hammock is a Colombian military hammock, and it has this mosquito net on it. And there were nights that you would just lose sight of anything beyond that, because it would be so thick with this intense noise of these mosquitoes, which is just absolutely hellish. It was incredible. And I remember spending some creepy nights there where I didn't get a lot of sleep, thinking, "My God, this is not a good place, not a place I want to be." And I hung out with these soldiers, and we would do things, because the soldiers were low on food as well, because some supplies hadn't reached them, and they were buying stuff from the locals, fish mostly.
Okay.
So fish and rice was the staple diet, and we would have competitions with the Colombian soldiers. So we would field strip weapons, blindfolded. And their weapon systems were somewhat similar to what our old weapon systems used to be, what we would call the SLR, the FN. Okay. And they had these weapon systems that were very similar. So I could join in, and I would have all these competitions with these soldiers, stripping their own weapons blindfolded, so you could do it the fastest, would get the larger portion of the fish and the rice, kind of thing. And this is the kind of things you'd do while they were bored,
entertainment
during the day, if they were not on the fence somewhere, on the wall, so to speak. So we had some pretty cool days. Again, I hung out with them. I learned a lot from them as well, the soldiers, about their turnaround times and their equipment and whatnot. And then eventually, I put together this camouflage stuff all around my backpacks. I'd got these bottles, so we'd figured out how we were going to do the river. So the combat vest basically got turned into a life vest by putting empty plastic water bottles.
Okay, I remember this. This is the part that just is amazing for me. This part of the journey.
It's pretty simple stuff, really. I mean, like river crossings in the army, that's how you do it. You build a flotation bundle, and then you just swim across with your equipment on the bundle to the other side. We're just doing the same thing, except it's a very long, several day river crossing.
Wow.
Now, in order to use this river, luckily when I got to the river, what I'd realized is it's a big wide river, and in the center of the river there's a lot of floating debris in these jungles, a lot of mangroves, a lot of stuff, a lot of vegetation in clumps, just floating down this river constantly. And that's great. So I could disguise my backpack, filled with plastic bottles and my stuff in plastic bags to keep it dry, what little stuff I had at that point. And then these plastic bottles and 2 big Coca-Cola bottles underneath this combat vest gives me a flotation device. And then I camouflage myself. And then we simply get into the river and just go with the flow. And that is it. It couldn't be easier. And then you just drift out into the center and mix with this debris, and then away you go. And it's a slow cruise. And it's the easiest part of the journey.
Do you have to worry about, I'm presuming you do, there's some sort of parasite or worm that's in the river that you're not supposed to go to the bathroom while you're in the river?
Oh, yeah, I think that's an Amazon thing.
Yeah,
same with things like piranha fish. That's an Amazon thing.
Okay.
We'd done some research. I'd done a bit of this in Medellin, so I'd looked at the river, and we'd looked at what's in there and what will eat and what won't. And at the end of the day, nothing's going to eat.
Okay.
The locals the locals again have all these horror stories about the big giant man-eating fish. Everyone knows that the common crocodiles, they look scary. They're maybe a meter or two long or so, but they're not interested in humans. They eat fish and they fish at night. And I would meet them. I would meet them a lot on the river.
Wow.
So on this river journey now, which at times was fascinating, but the crocodiles was the first thing. So when you're floating on these pans of debris, I do remember once meeting Carmen like nose to nose, because I'm floating in the water and he's on this vegetation, and we came around the corner of this vegetation bundle. Wow. And I'm literally nose to nose, with eye to eye with a Carmen, and they look scary and big at that point.
Oh yeah, I'll bet.
But then you just like back off slowly, and these things don't move. They don't move. The eyes don't move. They don't blink.
Until they're coming at you.
Hey, buddy. Hey, yeah, I'm on my way. No problem, bro. And then they leave you alone. What does freak you out are the iguanas jumping into the river. Because if you're close to the banks and you're cruising down the bank, and it's very, very quiet. It's very quiet, eerily quiet. And then something will jump into the water.
Oh.
And you'll look around and you'll just see all the ripples. So something just got in, and you're just looking at the water.
Oh my God!
It's just silent, and you just think, "Oh God!"
There's
a lot of that in that river,
and
it's the iguanas. But the iguanas keep freaking you out by jumping because they're big. These iguanas are huge, so it's like an alligator jumping into the water after you or something. So that's always on the back of your head. But I remember one time. Now you're in the river. You're spending all day in the water. Mm-hmm. It's hot. It's in the jungle, But the first maybe foot of that water is warm, and then below that the water gets quite cool.
Yeah.
And out there on the river it gets quite windy and choppy as well. It gets really windy and choppy. It's like being out in the ocean because it's a big enough river. And you get cold. You actually get quite cold. And so there were times I would make my way to the banks because I was getting really cold.
Yeah.
And I had to warm up.
Okay.
So I would get to the mud banks and I would crawl out onto the bank into the sun just to try and get warmed up. And then not far from me on the bank are all these crocodiles doing exactly the same thing. And maybe for the first time in history, man and alligator were absolutely unison.
What's up, guys?
Both using the banks to warm up under the sun to regenerate themselves before they get back in that river. So I'm basking on the banks with the crocodiles for the same reason, which is cool. It's just so unusual.
Totally.
So yeah, I really was in their world at that time, experiencing it firsthand. And then you go back into the river, back into the water, and continue once you'd warmed up a bit. And I just remember going past, especially when you're close to the banks, and you would see all the wildlife, so all the monkeys and everything. They ignore you in the water because you're camouflaged. They don't see you. And there would be these huge herons fishing on the side, and you would drift right below them. So you'd have these huge herons, and they'd be looking down at you, like you do, and they're just watching you as you pass, not able to work out what you are. And it was a real safari along that river, getting as close to these things that you would never normally get.
Yeah, everything comes down to the river, right?
Because you were hiding, primarily from anyone using the river, and there were a lot of people using the river. So there's a lot of traffic, and a lot of all kinds of boats and things, and also military convoys. They have these armored boats. They have these huge armored boats, and they have these fast speed boats with the big machine guns on them. So these patrols would come past you in the water, and you'd have these fast boats. They're escorting a larger armored boat with the big, huge guns on them, and if they can't get helicopters in to resupply Rio Sucio, then they'd have to find their ways in on these gunboats, just like the gunboats in Vietnam War, down these rivers. So they would pass me in these rivers. Again, no, they wouldn't see you. But there were 2 times I got caught in the river, twice. one of them, the first time it happened, I'm just drifting casually another day in the river, and on the banks, quite a long way off, there's a straw hut village. I can see a village, and I can see people. I can see the canoes and things along the river. And as I'm just drifting past slowly, watching this village, one of these two 2-liter Coke bottles had come loose, and it pops out. Mm-hmm. And when they pop out, they kind of like boom, and they jump out. And as that happens, your vest comes loose, and the other bottle tries to get out. So now you're losing your balance in the water as your buoyancy rapidly decreases. So I'm like in the water, struggling to get that bottle back in, and I'm trying to reach for that bottle that's now just out of reach. And I'm kind of like just rotating because there's my backpack, and normally I would hide behind the backpack. So I'd be behind the backpack, which is covered in vegetation, so that you can't see me. But now I'm in the water thrashing around, trying to get that bottle back, and eventually I get the bottle, get it back into the vest, everything's tight, and I'm good. And then I look at the village, and then I see all these kids running along the bank, and I'm like, wow, did they see me? And I have no idea who these people are. I don't know who they're affiliated with. And then I watched the kids run to the boats and the people on the bank, and then everyone just starts piling in the boats. Yeah. I'm like, shit.
Oh, they're coming to do a rescue.
Right? I'm like, I've been seen. They've seen me. They're coming out, and now before you know it, there's 2 canoes, and they're all coming out like this towards me, and you're just waiting, and you've got like 10 minutes before they get there, but there's nothing you can do. And as they're coming towards me, I see them get out the boat hooks, and then eventually they get to me, and everyone's like, they pull up alongside me, and everyone's grabbing on me, and they're trying to pull me out of the water into the canoes, and I'm like, no, leave me where I am.
I'm okay,
like,
really.
Get him out. And I'm like, no, don't. So we now engage in this weird conversation, this standoff with these people in these canoes that obviously think there's a guy in distress in the river, drowning or something, a white guy floating down this jungle river. So they're trying to get me out, and I'm fighting, and I'm like, no, I'm really happy here. Please leave me alone. And then, there's this weird kind of standoff. And then at one point, they're all just standing in the canoes, looking at me confused, muttering to one another. And they just let me go. And I'm wandering off, floating away, waving. Got it. I'm all good. Don't worry about it.
They're probably telling their children that story.
Like, what is he doing? What's going on?
They're probably telling that story today in that village, like 20 years later, they're still telling it.
Yeah, I had no idea
wild experience.
What I was doing.
Do you remember that day?
The weirdest thing. That's how legends begin, I think.
Yeah, totally.
So there was that time, and that nothing became of it. They just let me go. And then there was another time. At the end of the day, I'd get to the bank, I'd scramble out, and I'd put up my hammock in the mangroves. And there was this one morning, evening, I'm trying to get out. And I can't get up this bank. It's just so muddy that I'm sliding back down. And I'm just a real mess. And then out of these reeds along the river comes a dugout canoe with a couple of indigenous people. And they just kind of like cruise on by, just looking at me, all wide-eyed. And all they're really seeing is a guy in a green uniform with a black combat vest, And so you can imagine it's a lot alarming to see that in this war zone.
Dead? Alive?
Right. So they just go on by, and I'm like, bollocks to it. I'm too tired to care at this point, right? I get up there, I get everything set up, and I get in my hammock, and the day's done. And then sooner or later, I can hear people come in through the jungle, and I can hear them hacking away at the jungle. And there's a lot of people.
Wow.
And I realize that they're looking for me, and there's like a line hacking its way through the jungle, yelling and screaming, shouting for whoever's out there in the jungle to identify themselves. So I'm like, shit, again, I have no idea who I'm dealing with. I decide to go out and meet them, and I meet these people, they're villagers. Again, they're surprised to find me, but also excited to find me, and they obviously like, nope, you got to come back with us to the village. You can't stay out here. You're coming back. And they all get around me, take me back to the village, and they give me a straw hut to sleep in that night. Turns out that these guys had affiliated themselves with the right-wing paramilitaries again. So, I was surprised that this far out on the opposite side of the river, the right-wing paramilitaries still had some influence with these people. Because we're now, as far as I was concerned, we're well into FARC territory. But anyway, that was interesting. I spent the night there, being absolutely mercilessly chewed alive by mosquitoes. Hellish night. The next day, I was fed fish and rice, and on my merry way again. I think that the other point worth noting at this point as well is I was desperately sick. From Rio Sucio, I'd got a really bad stomach infection, so I had diarrhea. So I was in a bit of a mess at this point.
Draining your energy, right? You're just...
it really does. When you got serious diarrhea in that, and you just can't control your body at that
system,
point, you're suffering.
You're dehydrated.
And this had been going on quite a lot. And there were a couple of rancid stories. Like there was one night in the hammock where I'm having these intense stomach cramps. And remember I said that the mosquitoes thing, just, it's opaque. And I'm having these terrible stomach cramps. And, you got to get out and do what you got to do. And at one point I just give in. And I remember when I move in the hammock and the thing kind of sways, and then you brace to steady yourself, that I just let rip and just emptied my bowels into the hammock, and then just quit. Just slept in about an inch of liquid.
Oh my God!
I remember some gnarly days.
Ready to die.
Yeah,
where you were you're willing just to sleep in it at that point. You don't care. And the next day it doesn't matter because you're just going back into the river, where you're just merrily crapping yourself permanently as you go down the river, feeding the fish.
Wow.
It's pretty rancid at that point. But that's the state I was in at that point as well. So we were having a real hard time. Stomach was just in absolute tatters. And then eventually we make our way down through that river to a point where you're starting to see high ground on the banks of the river. And there is 60 kilometers. Oh, there you go. This is all the jumble bumble but we just talked about. Rio Sucio, the rivers, that's the flotation. This is a sample of the flotation. I did this after the fact to show people. It was artistic impression. It comes about. Right. Can you still hear me?
Yeah. Sounds like there's some noise in the background.
Yeah. So, we take a closer look on the map now where we are at this point. So you can see this is the river where we are from Rio Sucio. There's the border region. And this is the river. Basically now we've been drifting or floating for several days. 4 days I think it was. Around this river. Until we get to this point.
That's crazy.
Can you really hear that? Is that loud?
It's sort of breaking up the sound a bit. If you kind of talk into the microphone and keep a clear voice, we can get it.
I don't know what microphone. Is that any better?
Yeah.
Because I don't know if I'm using... It is?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you can see... you can see there on the map. So we get to a point where you see that higher ground to the west there. That's what we're aiming for.
Right.
And that's how to get out into the Darién Gap. But for me, the first day, I actually couldn't get out of the river.
Wow.
We got to the end of this, and the mangroves and the mud was so thick that I couldn't penetrate, and I couldn't find a way out. And eventually I became so exhausted that I quit, and I hammocked it above the water there that night. And then the next day, I eventually found a way into the jungle, which is just absolutely... The jungle in the Darién Gap is really something. That secondary jungle that we talked about. From that river to the borderline there is probably about 30 kilometers. I would do that in a day normally, in about 7 hours on the road. That would take me 10 days.
Wow. That's incredible.
10 hard days. That would be like from dawn till dusk, hacking at a jungle, and it was just horrific.
There's no trail
2
here.
kilometers a day.
This is pretty much carving your way through the jungle with a machete.
So again, the plan here is to avoid any trails, because that could lead you into trouble, like we'd seen, back before Rio Sucio. We didn't want to be in that situation. So the idea now was to punch a hole through the jungle to avoid the tracks, because that's probably how these guys got captured. These oh, that's so annoying. I can barely hear myself talking right now.
Oh, okay. We can hear you.
Good.
Yeah.
So, and one point to note as well is just before we started the journey into the Darién Gap, those botanists that disappeared, they actually came out of the jungle alive just before I left Medellin.
Yeah, you told us that.
And so the FARC had captured them, they'd held them, not told anybody, and then they let them go before Christmas, which was great news. Let you know that you don't know how these things are going to play. There's always a chance. And it was funny because they let them go in the jungle, so the guys ran off into the jungle, realized they have no idea where they're going, so then they had to go back to their captors, ask them for a map to be able to get out of there.
Yeah.
So FARC had to help them to get, once they let them go, they couldn't get rid of them, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So they had to go back and get a map so they could find their way out eventually. But the fact that they made it was good news. But we don't want to get captured, so we were basically, the name of the game was to stay off those tracks and punch a hole through this jungle, and it was just brutal. It was just horrible.
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
And very quickly found something called terrain shock, which was where it's just it's a kind of claustrophobic feeling where you're so closed in and you can't orientate yourself. So if I bent down or turn around or something and stood up, I have no idea what direction I was going in, where I'd come from. So it's so easy to become disorientated. You have no idea.
Yeah.
So you're literally working on a compass at this point. And the good news is with these jungles, these secondary jungles, is you've got easy access to GPS. So there's nothing blocking that GPS. So with a decent map, a GPS and a compass, you're good.
Okay.
And that's the way you do it. And you were literally, punching your way through the jungle with a compass in your hand to try and keep. It's just so easy to get lost and go around in circles or whatever. And sometimes you would do that because you'd be so tired fighting in that jungle, you get cut to ribbons and stuff, and you're weak anyway because of the stomach infection and the diarrhea and everything. So you're not great. So it's tough. And then you find faint, what look like what might have been tracks that are overgrown, and I would refer to them in my diaries as signals, like faint signals. And then so you wouldn't be able to resist using those because it's a relief from having to deal with a dense jungle. If there's a little gap there where you can maneuver, that's better. So that's a huge energy saver. Plus, your hands are all covered in blisters on that with that machete right now. So every swing hurts. So you follow I tend to used to follow those things, but they would lead you off, and you'd just be hoping and praying that they're going in their direction. But eventually, they'd lead you astray, so you'd have to come back and go back into the jungle. So it was a bit of a to and a fro, and it took a long time to get through that jungle, and it was exhausting. Now, one of the things, every now and then you'd come across a stream, a clearing in the jungle, where there'd be water. Because it's the dry season, the streams are very low, and they're absolutely crystal clear. And there's these little beautiful gardens of Eden within these dark jungles. You go down into a valley, and then there'd be this amazing crystal clear stream. And one of the first ones I came across, I remember just like, you get into this cool water, and it's just such an amazing experience, just lying in the water. And there would be like thousands of little fish just start picking off your skin. So they'd start chewing at your body all over. Oh, yeah. And And it's like kind of, like you can actually pay to have this thing.
Right, I've seen this in Thailand.
Yeah, fish.
You go to Thai massage place.
These little streams that follow these things. So you lay there and everything is just cleaning you. All these things are just picking away, which is kind of weird.
Yeah.
But what I noticed immediately then was there are bigger fish in that stream, and every time I drop anything in that water, they're on it. Like the fish would just appear, and you were like, for someone who's really low on food, whose rations were not cutting it, and who's seriously sick, this was a huge opportunity. So I unstitched my survival fishing kit, which gave me hooks and lines and weights, and then all around the banks of these little streams are tiny little frogs that became bait. A stick, a line, and within 5 minutes you were pulling in something
right.
Catfish.
Wow.
So
paradise.
You were within like half an hour you had a rack of stuff, and you were like, holy crap, I've never fished in my life. This was the first time. Because man, was this was gold. And
right on.
Because I was so deep in these valleys at that point, I really didn't have a problem with getting a fire going. Because you were under cover and everything, and it was great. So I got a fire going, and I just had these fish lined up. Oh my god, just the best thing ever.
Best fish you ever had.
Oh my god, the food was just awesome. So that was the new approach. We picked up on that pretty soon in the Darién Gap. So we started living off the jungle. There was that, and there was coconuts. Coconuts was not just a clean source of water, but also something to eat as well. And there was plenty of that around. So you started living off coconuts and fish, and that became the mainstay.
Large, getting healthy again.
Yeah, and you really are in the Garden of Eden. It's a pristine jungle. It's because
nobody's there.
Mostly because nobody there. You would at least have indigenous people there, but because of the conflict, it was well known that FARC had kicked out all the indigenous people. They'd all basically moved out because of the conflict. And what trails were there were now overgrown anyway, for the most part. And it's one of the only places in this world I have been where there is no sign of humanity. Not one fag butt, not one Coke can pole. No, bottle top, nothing.
Wow.
And it is pristine and absolutely beautiful in that Darién Gap. You think to yourself, has anybody ever been here before? You find these unique little places tucked away in the jungle, and you're like, am I the first human ever? Could it be possible? Because you feel so isolated and so remote in this place. And it's absolutely beautiful. But for the most part, at that point, I'm more focused on just getting through.
Yeah.
That was the end of the game. And again, you climb into the mountains. Some hard terrain. It gets mountainous, it gets steep. And eventually you get to a point where you reach what the GPS is telling you that you've reached the border.
Yeah.
Which is a big moment.
Into Panama.
So you've hit the border between North South America at this point. You're turning a big page in the book. And I'm leaving South America, and I remember getting to that border, which is basically for me just a GPS reading on a map. And I remember sitting down, and I just wept like a child. Like 10 minutes.
Wow.
Like I was just absolutely destroyed.
Yeah.
Cut to rip. And I was so exhausted at that point, and I remember just sobbing like a child. And to this day, the Darién Gap is probably one of the hardest things that I've done. One of the hardest things, but it certainly was an absolute test.
How many days into it are you at this point? From the road,
we're a long way in now. We're probably about a month or something.
Wow.
It took 2 months to get to Panama City, so we're about halfway through now, I think. So along those lines. At this point, we've still got to find Papaya, the first village. I want to get there because I want to get some real food down here, whatever, and rest a little bit. Plus, it's an important waypoint. I did a terrible mistake. I made a horrible navigation error, which I then realized at this point that I had actually no idea where Papaya was, this village. I just put a dot on a map with a pen where I thought it was, and I had no
and it wasn't
actual.
It wasn't there.
I had no I had no grid. I had no, and I was like, well, that's the dumbest thing I have ever heard of. Mm-hmm. So there I am, pushing out into this just jungle, looking for a place that
There's
really
nothing
no
here.
Where it is. Following a dot on a map, realizing suddenly last minute that I actually don't have a grid, no bearing of where this map is. So, but I have a rough idea. So I then basically start homing in on this village, and it's not hard to find, because wherever there's human civilization, there is an area around that's affected by humanity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you'll soon pick up on cultivation. Yeah. You'll start to see the differences. You'll see where people have been cutting trees. You follow that, and sure enough, soon you've got clearings, mm-hmm. banana plantations, and then all of that just leads into a central village. And then I come across the village. I'm on the opposite side of the river, and I remember just feeling quite happy that I'd found it, so relieved. And I sat on the other side of the river, and I observed the village, because I know FARC is still on this side of the border. Mm-hmm. So I watched the village for a while to make sure that there's nothing in that village that makes me suspicious. I'm just seeing indigenous, the Kuna Indians. Mm-hmm. So I'm watching them go about their business for a while, getting my breath back, and then eventually I go in. And they're beautiful villages. They're so well kept. They're like show villages. So the grass is mowed, and everything's clean, and super tidy, and well organized. And like I said, these are Kuna Indians, and I meet the village boss, and I end up staying with his family at their house.
Wow.
And these are not Latinos yet. These are the Kuna Indians. So I hang out with them. I eat some stuff, and it's a real privilege to find yourself in the middle of a jungle so far away with native peoples like that.
I'll bet.
And just hang with them, and this garden, this garden of Eden. It's beautiful. So I remember really relaxing there for a little while before hitting the track again. But between this track and the track called Pukuro, so it's me talking about what I'm living up in the jungle at. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, Papaya, which is in there, and there's you can see some pictures there. So there's me with the village boss, cool. And his family, his kids.
Yeah, you definitely look. You've changed your outfit. Yeah. You definitely got the more military jungle gear going.
Yeah, what you're seeing there is actually it's like a clothing that I would wear when I got out of the jungle. It's something dry to change into, mm-hmm. or what I would use in the rivers. It's just basically a parachute material stitched into a suit. Yep, I know that stuff.
It dries real quick.
Like a jumpsuit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's super thin, super light. Loved it. Mm-hmm. Again, it's something that came from my father.
All right.
Something the special forces used to use. That was personally made for me. So they get me one of those. That's the village, and then I left the village. And now what they had was this beautiful track, just a clean track, a rail track to the next village. So I'm whistling.
You're moving now.
Best time of my life at this point. I'm moving. Feeling pretty confident. Leaving the worst of it behind me. Colombia's behind me. Well, after Pukuro, which is another beautiful village, we then get back into the rivers. So now we're back into the rivers, and what is basically amphibious mode. We've been living in rivers for a lot, so it wasn't a problem. Mm-hmm. These rivers are shallow. Sometimes they're fast flowing, like rapids. And I was just having a jolly old time. I'm loving it now. Okay. I'm starting to relax, and I'm having a great time floating down these rapids, and or just wading and walking. And I'm really lucky that everything is going my way at this point.
Yeah, it's all downhill.
It wasn't lost on me how hard it would have been to get from, let's say, Panama to Colombia. Same route would have just been an absolute nail kicker. I mean, you'd have had your ass whooped so hard. Don't know if I could have done it, because you couldn't have used those rivers, and the jungles were just horrific. Mm-hmm. And these rivers really are the ticket out of there. So everything is going in my direction, which is fantastic. Now the river journey continues for another day or two, I think, until eventually I get to the vicinity of somewhere called Boca de Cupa. And I crawl out of the river into a banana plantation, into the southern end of this village, looking like a creature from the Black Lagoon. Again, green uniform, black combat vest, looking pretty rough at this point, I suspect. Yeah. And I come out of this plantation, cross through this plantation, and I come across a series of huts, and there's a hut with a sandbag wall, and it's got an M60 machine gun on it, pointing out towards me. There's nobody manning it.
Okay.
But I'm suddenly struck. I wasn't expecting this. So I hit this belt-fed machine gun, sandbag wall, and I'm like, wait a minute. And I step around the corner of the hut, and right there in front of me, there's a guy in a green uniform with an AK-47.
And you're looking pretty militant yourself.
Right. So we're now looking at each other at point blank range. And of course, that AK comes up right at me. And he's screaming, "Who are you?" And I'm staring down the barrel. Now, and my first reaction is one of despair, because at this point, the only people that have a green uniform and an AK-47 is FARC. Like no one else uses that I know of. So I'm like, just no way. So now I drop to my knees with my hands on my head, and he's screaming, "Who are you?" And I'm just screaming, "Who are you?" So there's this ridiculous conversation. "Who are you? No, who are you? Who are you?" kind of thing, tense going on. And behind him is pandemonium. So I'm seeing guys running around. I'm seeing people running everywhere and grabbing guns. And it's like the hornet's nest. And I'm sitting there like just kind of semi-panic stricken right now, not knowing what's about to happen. And I look, and I notice that next to the machine gun, there's a Kevlar helmet. And I know that the FARC guerrillas don't use Kevlar helmets. And then beyond him, there's a makeshift washing line with some black T-shirts hanging on it. And one of those black T-shirts, I can see and I can read La Policía de Frontera de Panama.
Oh, okay.
And it dawns on me. So it dawns on me that I've come across the Panamanian police. And then I remember that after the U.S. invasion, Panama doesn't have an army. So the police are basically now a default military force. So they're dug in on their side of the wall, defending their villages against FARC. Yeah. Because FARC raid the villages and towns for food and medicine and everything else. So this is what I've walked into. But of course, I hadn't expected that. I've learned all of that within a rapid couple of seconds of chaos and pandemonium as I'm facing these guns. So things are really tense. The tense standoff. Eventually, they pick me up, check me down. Yeah. I show them a passport. I explain to them what's going on. They take me to meet their boss, and everybody calms down.
Yeah.
And then the boss is pretty pleasant and speaks a bit of English and whatnot. You can tell when everyone, after a tense standoff, because I've had tense standoffs like this in Colombia, one point as well with the police and army. And once they get beyond the threat, everyone really relaxes and is really chilled and is really happy. Yeah. There's kind of like a bounce. So there's a kind of a peak of happiness where everyone's kind of
smiles,
like, yay, no bullets and death today. That's good news. Because everyone was pretty high. Everything was pretty high tensely strung for a moment there. So they're all pretty happy. They're all chilling out. And the boss is like, okay, great. We've got a place for you to stay. And I'm like, oh, you guys, that's awesome. Thanks very much. So they take me into a concrete building and they put me into a room, and then the door closes. This big metal door closes, and the key turns and you're in a cell. And I'm like, oh, you mean one of those places to stay? Kind of comment. I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. Okay. I was like, okay. Why are you now putting me in a cell? Yeah. And they were like, okay, listen, there's a problem. The border's closed because of the conflict. We don't know who you are. Technically, you're kind of illegal. You've crossed the border without an entry point. Yada yada. So we're going to hang on to you for a little while we figure out what we do. And I'm like, yeah, okay, no problem. I get it. The guy, they were nice about it, but so now I'm sitting in a cell. And I spent a couple of days in the cell, not allowed to communicate with anybody until they've figured out what they're going to do. And then one day I get a message. They take me out during the day, and they let me sit with the soldiers to feed. So I would sit with them around a table in their little canteen area that they have.
Yeah.
And so I hang out with them, and things are pretty fine. And then they put me back in the cell. Eventually, news gets down that they're going to send a helicopter to take me out of the jungle. And I'm just absolutely adamant that I can't do that. Right? You do that, destroys everything I've worked for the last X number of years, man. It's down. I can't use transport. And they were like, yeah, sorry, what can we do? Orders, you know what it's like. Anyway, so eventually, I get a bit pissed off at this point. But there's not a lot I can do. But eventually an old Huey helicopter arrives, stick me in the chopper, and the Huey is taking me to a regional HQ, police HQ, called a town called Metati, which is just north of the Darién Gap, north of Yavitsa. On the way there, the helicopter develops a fuel leak. So they have to put down in Yavitsa. So the helicopter ends up making a semi-emergency descent into Yavitsa, where we then get out the chopper, go to the police station in Yavitsa, where they put me in a room with a couple of Colombians that they've picked up trying to cross the border. Now what I start to learn about is the whole immigration situation that they face in Panama. So they regularly pick up people trying to make their way through or get smuggled through various parts of the Darién Gap. And the police are, regularly rounding them up. So now I'm getting rounded up and put into the system with these other illegal immigrants trying to make their way north. And they're poor people, they don't have paperwork, etc. So I get put into this truck with these Colombians, there's a father and a son, these Colombians and a few other individuals, I don't know who they are. And then we're trucked north to Metati, and we get out. And at this point, they've stripped me of everything, even the shoelaces from my boots. So now we're being kind of, we're pretty much prisoners, so to speak, in the true sense of the meaning, under armed escort. We are filed off the truck. We're all filed into a room, and then we're taken out of this room in Metati, this regional headquarters, where they start interviewing us. And a lot of questions are coming my way. A lot of, why are you here? What are you doing? Why are you with the Colombians? I'm not with the Colombians. You put me in a truck with the Colombians and brought me here, and they can't seem to get their heads around that. They keep going back to, why am I with the Colombians? Again, I'm not with the Colombians. You put me with the Colombians. And it was just kind of conversation, and it kept going for a while. And they'd put us back in the cell, and then they'd take us back out. And this went on for a day or two. And then they transferred us to another cell. I end up in a small cell, and there's just a hole in the floor to crap in. There's Peruvians, there's Argentinians, there's these Colombians.
These are all people who are trying to go north to...
Yeah, and then there's this white guy. And we're all in there. It's just a tight space, nothing to do. We've got a bit of foam to sleep on. We spend our day doing push-ups and stuff. And then one day, I'm still not allowed to communicate. I'm not allowed to talk to anybody. It's been days, so nobody knows where I am or whatnot. I haven't been able to speak to anybody. Now, the British embassy knows that I was coming. We had spoken to them, but I'm not allowed to talk to them for some reason. Until eventually I get to speak to the boss. So everyone keeps going about the boss guy that I've got to talk to before I'm allowed to talk to anybody else. But then eventually one day, this guy in plain clothes turns up at the bars of my cage, my little cell, and he's asking for me. And I introduce myself, and he introduces himself as the intelligence officer for the region. And he has some questions. He notes that I was picked up and collected with this equipment, and what he's particularly interested in is the GPS and a map. He wants to know what I've seen. So they take me out of the cell and they put me next door in the office, and he gives me a map and he starts asking me these questions. And I click on pretty I realized pretty soon that the type of questions that he's asking are all security orientated. And it becomes quite evident that he wants to know what I've seen.
You become an intelligent asset.
Well, now, so this guy's job and responsibility is to figure out what the hell is going on that border region. What's happening on the other side. I don't know if the Americans are telling him anything. I don't know what the Americans have at that point. So it's hard to figure out. Again, it's all, this confusing information warfare thing going on. Everyone wants to know what's happening here, there, and everywhere. So I realized what he wants. So I'm like, hey, dude, get me a black pen, get me a red pen, and get me a blue pen. Give me like half an hour and let me at it. And he's like, okay, whatever. Here's some pens. So I know what he wants. So I put it on the map using the military symbolism. So
what's
units and sizes and fronts, radio bases. And I just start putting it all on the map. And he just lights up. I mean, he's just absolutely ecstatic. So we just have this endless conversation. And he becomes my best friend.
Okay.
And he's like, he's sending people on road trips to buy
this
me
guy some
packets
food.
Of chips and cookies and whatever it is that I want at this point. Coca-Cola, you name it. So I got it all coming in. So I have a good deal going on. But yeah, I mean, having learned so much, I could give him just a wealth. And not just, what I'd seen, but I could give my experience as an ex-soldier. I know what the weapon systems are. I know what the radios are. I know. I can tell you what their discipline's like. I can tell you what's bothering the soldiers today on the ground.
Wow.
So that was just, for them, that was just like, oh, awesome.
Yeah.
So he becomes my best friend. But still, I'm in jail. And there's nothing they can do yet. So I go back into the cell. And then a day or two later, they then take us again from that holding cell. They put us on boats and they drive us off. Do I have anything? Oh, here's the guys. This is the guys I met.
Oh.
The guy kneeling down on the bottom right there, right hand corner with the AK is the guy I ran into.
With a cigarette.
Okay, yeah.
So this was the section that kind of held that section of that town at the time. The boss is standing up, second in on the right side there. They were great guys. There's me in the cell.
Wow. How long did you spend in there?
Well, then they transferred me to a prison. So it gets even greater at this point. So now I get transferred to a large holding prison in a village out on a peninsula in this beautiful area of lagoons and estuaries out from Panama, called La Palma. And there's a big jail there, about 100 inmates or something in a large compound. So they've got a whole prison system. So they put us on boats, they ship us out there, and then we go processed through this system. I'm stripped. They take out, again, you've got no bootlaces. You do paperwork. My equipment has gone with me in bags labeled, but I don't get to handle that. But they keep hold of that kind of thing. Now, as I'm being processed, I'm looking at a compound filled with about 100 indigenous and West African inmates.
Okay.
There isn't a white man within 100 miles of this place.
Right.
So I'm getting some real attention right now. And it's a pretty intimidating thing to be looking at.
Oh, bad.
So as I'm watching the guys in front of me get processed, and as you get through the system, they give you a bowl, and then they open the gate and they throw you in the compound. Close the gate. And the next guy goes, and I'm hinching my way, and they're all hanging on the cage, and they're all these inmates are howling and yelling about the white guy. And I'm just, oh man,
this is bad.
This is a horror movie right now. Are they really just going to throw me in that compound? So anyway, open the gate. I get a ball in my hand, and they throw me into the compound. And there's this standoff where I'm in there, surrounded by all these inmates, and there's some mean-looking individuals, and these are like low-grade offenders.
Yeah.
These are thieves, sex offenders. They're not murderers because they all go to Panama City. But if you're dealing with a hell of a bunch.
Oh,
and I remember, remember the whole thing about you got to find the biggest guy in the yard and knock him out kind of thing that you often hear, that meme that people use. Well, in this case, it was just banter. And at this point, I remember mouthing off to them in Spanish about being the más feo hombres en el mundo. It's the group who is just like, you're just the ugliest group of people I've ever seen, kind of thing is what I said. And, you know, they all started laughing. And so it kind of broke the ice to get, you know, because faced with this crowd, kind of, you got to do something.
Sure.
But it turns out that they'd actually heard about me. And they knew who I was. They knew a little bit about my story or history. So the first thing that happened was...
You're that legend, the guy that was in the river.
Took my bowl off of me and gave me a bigger one. And he said, you're going to need this because we've heard about you. So I had a bigger food bowl. And then another guy comes over with a piece of foam and he says, there's nothing to sleep on, but you can have this.
Wow.
Like, holy crap. So, you know, the whole fear thing, everything just suddenly switched once they put me in this compound. And all these guys are like, yeah, you know, welcome kind of thing. Yeah. We've heard about you. It's freaking awesome. Here's a bigger bowl because you're a bigger man. You need it. Here's something to sleep on, kind of thing. And it's like, holy crap. Nice. There were a couple of crazies there that I had to keep your eye on. But, you know, and one of the guys that befriended me was this great big guy. And he looked to me like a Fijian. He looked like he was, you know, Polynesian, but he was huge again. And he like really befriended me, spoke good English. So he gave me a tour around this compound, which wasn't much. There was a building with a roof, a lot of old beds in there that had been taken up. But other than that, you're sleeping on the floor. And again, there was just one hole in the ground for this entire compound to crap in, which just went straight out into the estuary, because this entire compound was on the edge of the shore. This coast, this line on the estuary, and that was it. And wow, my God, the places I found myself.
The most unexpected place that you're gonna get some kindness.
Oh yeah, again, this is, you know, my journey is this constant story of finding kindness in the strangest places, places that you wouldn't expect to find. And this is one of those. Because you're in one of the last place you'd ever expect to find that kind of thing, and yet it's there. You know, it's just there. It's just still this weird sense of humanity at every level. And then the officer that I talked about that later that day was because I don't think I even spent one night there. Okay. And then I was at the gate, looking through that gate at the free world outside. The intelligence officer arrived, and I saw him walking his way to the main building, and I yelled at him, and he saw me, and then he was like, and he saw me in there, and he started going like, he started yelling at people and saying, why is he in there, kind of thing. And then so he stormed over to the headquarter building, and he made them take me out. He said, you know, we're not keeping you inside that prison. So they took me out of that, and they put me in the police canteen. But all told, this would be 18-day process.
Wow.
And it was an eye opener being in that jail. I couldn't believe it. I'd spoken to people, immigrants, including those people that I'd been picked up with, the Colombian father and son, and the Peruvians. But there were people who had been in there for like 8 years and had never ever spoken to anyone outside that. What? They didn't know if their family knew they were dead or alive. Wow. They knew nothing. Wow. Just because, and their only offense were being pointed out, being illegal immigrants, getting picked up. They got put in this thing, and they're in this system, and they don't know anything. They get told nothing. That, to me,
you're
is
lucky.
Just horrific.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a white man. I'm privileged. My white privilege is glowing like a Christmas tree out there. You know, I don't have a problem. I know this thing is going to go away soon. You know, the embassy knows I'm there. At some point, I'm going to get that phone call. They keep telling me I'm going to get a phone call. And I know that this isn't my fate. But for these guys, it was horrible to think that you would now just spend years.
Yes, 8 years without talking to anybody.
I know nothing.
Wow.
Know nothing. Just disappear off the face of the earth. That to me that's a concentration camp at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That was horrible. So I never forgot that. Anyway, in the police canteen, being a white man, having all that white privilege, that they were looking after me pretty good. And it was funny. I remember another funny story there as well. The police canteen was having some repairs done to it. It was all palapas and wood and everything. And the inmates were being made to do some work with some saws. They were cutting beams to replace these beams on these palapas. And they keep breaking the saw blades. And there was a yelling match at one point where the guards were yelling at some of the inmates because they busted the last one. Now they had to wait to get the blades. So I thought, this is going to be fun. So I kind of interdicted and said, wait, I think I might have something to help. So I opened up the stitches along the collar of my jacket, the clothes that I'm wearing, the only clothes I've had for months, and then pulled out a wire saw, which is just awesome in a prison after you've been searched 1,000 times. And then pulled out a wire saw and handed it to the prison guards and said, maybe you could use that.
This guy's definitely
the look on their faces was priceless.
Special operations.
Amazing stories, girls. You'll never run out of stories. Really mind-blowing every time we hear this.
Right. They were like, what else? What else you got going on? And I had razor blades and wires and pills and knives. You name it.
I got some money.
Wow.
So that was funny.
Yeah, your stories are really just mind-blowing.
It was an interesting time. And then, of course, eventually one day, I made that phone call. I spoke to the embassy. Mm-hmm. There was some delays. There was bureaucracy. There was carnival season. There was, so it stretched out. It's about 18 days, and then eventually they just opened the doors and said, away you go. Mm. And now I got to get back to Boca de Cooper, right? Because I can't break my chain.
Right.
So now I had to make my way all the way back to Ivica, back into the jungle. And I have to make my way out through the jungle to Boca de Cooper, get to that police captain and get him to sign paperwork to say that I arrived back there. Now I can turn around and continue the journey because I can't break that chain.
Yeah.
So, and then I have to work my way out of the Darién Gap again. So there's another, like a week or something. Going back and forth.
So you then did that round trip in about a week.
To do that round trip, probably a couple of days, probably close to a week, I think.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. I can't remember. I probably have to go look. I'll have to go look at my notes. I don't have my book available right now. But eventually I go back to Boca de Cooper, and then you're on the road, and then it's like a 2-week journey up that road. It's a huge, long, dirty, dusty road. Then eventually you'll get out of the Darién Gap onto a metal road. Things get easier, and then I remember it's a big day walking into Panama City, and then to the British Embassy, which is a multi-story building, a big skyscraper. But Panama City is like nothing you've ever seen.
So now, how many days are you here? You're walking.
That's about 2 months now.
2 months to cross the Darién Gap.
Yeah, to get to Panama City. And I remember going into the embassy, and they put me in a room. They had a box that arrived from my mother, full of chocolate and sweeties and things, like mothers do. A little goodie box that arrived before me.
What a moment!
I remember sitting in a leather chair in this beautifully ornate room in the embassy, overlooking the city of Panama, like 15 stories or something. And it was like the first time when it was. I sat in that chair. And it was like, index, it's done. Like that was it. That was the moment.
Yeah.
I just
all
finished.
All these years you've been thinking about it.
For 2 months. Yeah, for 2 months since Medellin. We'd looked at this scary thing in front of us, gap number 1, and then your life had been so focused on just getting through this ordeal, and I think that was the first moment that I'd sat down and just threw a switch.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it was done. And it was just an amazing feeling. And I remember that night, the embassy took me to a hotel room. They put me in a hotel room. And that night, I actually lived the Darién Gap in a way that I hadn't in the Darién Gap. Like as I fell asleep that night, I lived it. I smelt it. I heard it. I saw the birds. I experienced it. I could feel it in a way that you don't when you're in it. because you're too busy, too focused,
but you're soaking it all
struggling. And then you just go through this decompression phase where you live it, and you just and you realize how amazing an experience you just had. Like you start to see those beautiful colored birds, and you start to hear what it's like in the jungle, and you start to smell it, and you start to just really take it all in. And it's a process, and it's amazing. It's amazing.
That's incredible. Karl, how many years had you been from your start in the very tip of South? How many years now at that point were you on your journey?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
You can't hear you.
Hello?
I think
16.
Siri.
No, can you repeat that?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do hear you.
Okay. Guys, I'm sorry. What happens is all the time I'm talking to you, I have Siri, who's back again, and she's constantly bugging me and saying, I'm sorry, I didn't get what you said. Say that again. I'm sorry, I don't understand. I'm sorry, contact who? You would like to Facebook with who? You want to send an email to who? I'm sorry, I cannot find that. I'm sorry, I do not. And she's just going on and on in my ear, and I can't close it down while I got this open or something.
Okay.
So while I'm trying to talk to you, Siri is just going at me like full on, just like so.
My God.
I'm trying to ignore her, and I don't know whether she just cut us off there. I don't know.
So my question, Karl, is you're at your embassy. How many years into it were you at this point from the very start of your journey?
Well, Medellin is 2 years, almost to the day. So you're just beyond the 2-year mark.
So you're 2 years, 2 months.
2 years, 2 months when you reach.
2 years, 2 or 3 months in at that point, I guess. Yeah. Well, it's 2 years, 2 months, 4 months, more like 4 months.
Okay.
Wow.
Congratulations, you made it across the Darién Gap. You'd been thinking about that for 2 years. You didn't. In fact, you said in the beginning of your trip you didn't even really know about the Darién Gap, did you?
There wasn't a lot out there. I mean, there are stories. Tourists used to go through the Darién Gap. There used to be, tour trips through there, but all of course, with the war in Colombia, all that got closed down quite early on. So, and then overgrown. But there's not a lot of information available as to where and how to get through the Darién Gap. What information you could find was no longer relevant. Those tracks are all gone. Places that closed down, there was no infrastructure going through there, it was just a war zone.
How do you think it? It compares today? Yes. When you look at the Darién Gap today?
Well, this is and I was just about to say, post Darién Gap, it was interesting to see how things shook up. I think it was 15 days after getting through Colombia, that road, there was a major offensive against the Colombian army on that road by FARC. So basically there was a huge military offensive by FARC along those towns on that road. 15 days after I'd gone down that road.
Just made it in time.
So we got out of there in time. I know as I was leaving Colombia, there was a huge offensive in the south of Colombia about to begin because the Colombian government had given FARC a huge area of land in the center of Colombia, that given it to FARC in concessions for peace talks, which hadn't worked, and now the Colombian army was about to mount an offensive to retake that land back as I was leaving Colombia. So times were pretty tense. I'm assuming that offensive was probably part of that operation, counter-offensive by the FARC. And then years after going through that jungle in Panama, I think in 2004, 2005, there was a huge refugee crisis in that area, where all the FARC went into those villages and they executed the heads of those villages. So those pictures, those photographs I have of that man and his family, the Kuna Indian in that village, there's a chance that he was executed by FARC a year or two later. Those villages emptied, or Boca de Cupa became a refugee camp for a lot of the indigenous people at that point. So the situation deteriorated after I'd been through there. It didn't get any better. But today, I don't know what the situation is there. I can only assume after, the peace talks with FARC and the decommission of FARC in Colombia, that things are probably a lot better now.
Someone, I can't remember who we were talking to the other day. We had somebody on the show. And
I know once I got into Panama, there was a lot of interest by the embassy and the Americans. The embassy took me out to dinner one night, and I was invited out it was the 2IC of the British Embassy, and he was the US naval attaché, the officer in charge there, the naval attaché officer, and a guy who worked for the CIA. The three of them took me to the most expensive restaurant in Panama, and they had them wheel out a trolley laden with steaks. Wow. And they were like, take your pick, whatever you want. It's on us tonight. All we want you to do is to tell us everything you know about the Darién Gap.
You're easy to corrupt at this point. It doesn't take much money, just a couple steaks.
I'll do anything.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm so into the double agent thing at that point. I'm like, I'll tell anybody anything. Yeah. I'm in.
Yeah. So
steak.
With that said, were you at that point threatened, or did you feel scared because you had sensitive information?
No.
No.
I don't think you don't have sensitive information. You've been privileged.
It wasn't? Okay.
By our experience, but you're not really. There's not real sensitive information.
All right.
You've got on the ground experience. You've seen some things they haven't seen. Obviously, valuable information, but nothing that's incriminating.
Most of the information I'd seen is time sensitive. All those shapes on those maps, they move around a lot, very fast. There's nothing there that was probably worthless 24 hours to 5 days after I'd seen it, really. In military intelligence terms, it's not really that spectacular. It's interesting if you're the intelligence officer in Panama whose job it is to find out what's going on either side of that border. There was some stuff there that would have helped him, right?
Yeah.
Even just little stuff like that village. When I got caught in the river that time by those people in that hut village who identified themselves as right-wing paramilitaries or orientated to right-wing paramilitaries, to me that was interesting because that felt like it was so far into FARC territory, and that kind of thing would have been interesting to them in Panama as well, I'm sure. And the military information, the unit type numbers and things, that helps them. In the intel world, every little bit of information can correlate and be cross-referenced with something else to confirm something else. So every little bit plays its part.
That was pretty good. Pretty good session with you once again. This is always Joe Rogan style when you get on board. Hey, so good to see you.
I gotta go take a listen to your podcast with this astronaut,
Colonel Terry Virts, and we'll keep you posted.
I'll try to do that tonight.
And we've got that other team, Tom and Tina, here next week, so we'll send you a link for that.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Carl, thank you.
Brilliant. And we need to talk.
Yes, we will.
We need to talk about other things.
Thanks again for
your time.
Everything.
Yeah.
Again and again.
Let's talk again. Take care over there.
Whenever you guys can, let me know.
Okay.
I'm here.